Good morning, everyone. This is the Carl Sagan's Guide to Fake News Q&A webinar. I'm very helpfully assisted by Chantel Nobbs today from University of Surrey. I think he's going to say a few words now.
Yes, yeah, great, thanks. So hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us and welcome to this another episode of our virtual World Space Week activities. So this, as John said, this is the Q&A session for the Guide to Fake News resources that John provides and keeps up to date on his website. And hopefully you'll all have had a chance to visit the website, have a look at some of those stories and decide for yourself as to whether or not you think they are fake news or not. And we're hoping that you'll have come along today with some questions for us. So if you can get your questions into that question box, into the chat box, and we'll come to those in a minute. And while you're thinking of some of your questions, I thought we'd just start with a bit of an introduction from John, figuring out who John is and what's going on with this session today. So John, fake news, I certainly from my perspective, is becoming an increasingly popular topic and this sort of buzzword that we're hearing all the time, and it's almost become a slogan, I think, for some politicians, using it as a shield. So how did you yourself become interested in and sort of passionate about this topic of fake news and sort of deciphering it?
So I first started to get interested in this about 4 years ago or so. So I was approaching the end of my full-time career as an IT director, and I was getting ready to go into semi-retirement, but not full retirement, because I wasn't ready to give up work altogether. And I was thinking about what I should do. And I thought back across my career, and I thought about the things in my career that had frustrated me. And the things that had frustrated me in my career had tended to be when decisions had been made that didn't make any sense to me. And when I analysed why those decisions had been made, it was generally because they had been based on some false assumptions, some duff information that sat behind them in the first place. And it also seemed to me that this was becoming increasingly prevalent in the news. It was at the time of the Brexit referendum. The famous bus appeared in the news, and Trump was starting to be on the news a lot. And I thought, why are people starting to listen to this stuff? So I did some research, and my research uncovered a book by a chap called Carl Sagan. And for those of you who are interested in space, you probably know who Carl Sagan was. He produced a very famous TV series in the 1970s called Cosmos, and wrote an excellent book called Pale Blue Dot, all about our place in the universe. But at the end of his life, he wrote a book called The Demon Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark. And it's basically a defense of the scientific method, because at that time, Carl Sagan was becoming very concerned about what the 1990s equivalent of fake news was, which was there was a lot of new age type of hippie stuff going on at that time. There were people telling you that crystals could cure your cancer, the kind of stuff that Gwyneth Paltrow sells on her website today. Now, in that book, in The Demon Haunted World, Carl Sagan wrote a chapter called The Fine Art of Baloney Detection, chapter 12. And that's, I think, is a really useful chapter that all of us should read, to be honest, because what it does is it sets out a list of 9 things that you should do if you're trying to prove your hypothesis, which is a scientific way of saying argue your point. And he also lists a set of 20 things, and these are things that you shouldn't do if you're trying to argue your point. And if you hear anybody else doing them, then maybe you should start to smell the baloney, because perhaps the person trying to make that particular point isn't really giving you the full story if they're having to rely on these 20 or so rather lame arguments types of method. And it's quite interesting, because if you hold this list of 20 up and then watch the news at the moment, I bet for sure you'll be ticking 4, 5, 6, 7 of them off just in the course of one news broadcast. So I've become very passionate about it because I think it's a skill set. We all kind of instinctively have it, but to see it kind of written down and mechanized, I think it really, really helps us, and it encourages us to question ourselves and the information we receive. And I think in the modern world, we increasingly get more and more of our information through social media sources, and there's a real risk those can become echo chambers. So we just start listening to news we like, or that we like the sound of, or that reinforces our own opinions or biases. And I think it's really important that we be open to all sorts of different opinions and different biases, and be able to see the truth from the baloney. The final thing I'd say is I think there's also an increasing trend where it's seen as important to have an opinion. And actually, I think it's okay to say you don't know. And science is mainly based on saying we don't know. And particular, if you look at space, and we're in World Space Week, there's a huge amount we don't know about the universe, despite the vast breadth of knowledge we've accumulated over the past 1,000 years or so. There's still huge amounts of things we don't know. And what science is trying to do is, by experiment and inquisition and discovery and hypothesis, is to uncover that new information, to discover the way the universe really works. And saying you don't know is an important part of that process. And I think it's an important lesson that we could all learn in our lives. Saying you don't know and you want to find out more is a really useful skill to have.
Oh, well, thank you, John. Yeah, I would certainly echo that as a scientist myself. Being able to actually say I don't know, is definitely often the right thing to do, and leads you to better results in the end, where you actually figure out the answers rather than just guessing. So while people are still getting their questions into the question box, please do drop them in there, and we can answer all your questions about fake news. I'll just ask you another one, which is probably quite a good place to start, which is, what is the difference between fake news and just plain lying?
Well, I think the reality of that answer is there isn't really any difference between fake news and lying. It's just that we tend to use lying in a more pejorative sense. I had this discussion with a friend of mine the other day, and they were arguing that perhaps the difference is to do with motivation. So you could maybe say a liar is being more intentionally malevolent. But I don't think that's true. I think whether you consider it a lie or fake news, if you're on the receiving end of it and you get an untruth, you should be equally skeptical and equally as inquisitive and equally as curious to try and uncover what the real truth is. And a lie can be just as damaging whether the person telling the lie meant to tell a lie or not, or is simply relaying or repeating or resharing the same mistruth or fake news, if you like. So whether you know you're lying or you're doing it unconsciously, it doesn't matter if you're on the receiving end of that. Whether you're spreading fake news intentionally or unintentionally, it doesn't matter if you're on the receiving end of it. So I think the answer to that question is there really isn't an answer, and they're both just as damaging.
Oh, well, thank you. So I've got one question that's come in from Andy, which is, what makes a good hypothesis?
So a good hypothesis is one that fits the available facts. So in the set of stories that I'm list on the fake news website to investigate, one is the headline, Jupiter has a liquid metallic hydrogen core. Now that at present is a hypothesis, because nobody has been to Jupiter and had a little swim in the liquid metallic hydrogen ocean. In fact, if you did that, it would probably be extremely bad news for you, given the immense temperatures and pressures involved. But given the available facts that we have, that Jupiter we know has a huge magnetic field, which actually kind of moves around a little bit, which would be would reinforce the theory that it's a liquid, an ocean that's moving around on Jupiter, and that we also know that Jupiter from spectroscopy is predominantly made of hydrogen. This hypothesis fits the available facts. Now, it may be that in time there'll be more information made available by probes such as Juno, which is up there at the moment, that say that hypothesis isn't real. But at the moment, that's the best hypothesis we have because it fits the available facts. Interestingly enough, in the States at the moment, there's science going on trying to actually create liquid metallic hydrogen, which involves squeezing hydrogen. Got some very complicated machinery with lots of carbon and stuff in it to try and do this. It's very difficult because you can't recreate the temperatures and pressures necessary, but they're trying to do that at the moment to see if this hypothesis holds up, because if such a thing as liquid metallic hydrogen really exists in our universe, it could be eventually useful and have lots of practical applications as well as telling us about the nature of Jupiter.
Mm-hmm. So we've got another question come in from Anna, which is, how do you make the truth more appealing to seek out when lies can be so comforting for people?
Oh, Anna. I think we do tell our children lies, and Carl Sagan he talks about this in his book. He talks about Father Christmas and things like that. So I don't wish to burst anybody's bubble here about the kind of lies that we tell ourselves to make ourselves feel comfortable. There's also an argument that says that those things aren't necessarily their lies. They're just unprovable hypotheses, right? So one of the arguments that Carl Sagan says is if somebody's trying to prove something to you and they use the following argument, then it's not a very good argument, is he talks about the ignorance as proof argument. And the example I give of that is, you can't prove to me that a magical invisible pixie is not stood directly in front of me. Therefore, the magical invisible pixie must exist. So you can't prove to me that that thing isn't true. Therefore, it is true. Now, lots of our kind of tales to make our comforting lies, if you like, make us feel comfortable, actually fall into this category. So they're not strictly lies. They're just unprovable hypotheses. Now, an unprovable hypothesis is in general not very useful. It's certainly not very useful for decision-making purposes. So, you know, I can't employ the magical invisible pixie to do a job for me. I can't get him to clean my car. I can't even get him to play with my children. So it's not very helpful from that perspective. But if it's providing some comfort, then maybe it is some use. So a harmless, unprovable hypothesis isn't necessarily a bad thing, especially if it's providing some comfort to people. So in his book, Carl Sagan also talks a lot about religion, and in general, most religions around the world are actually trying to provide a set of rules that are fairly kind of common sense. Don't kill each other, don't tell lies, the stuff that's in the Ten Commandments, etc., etc. These are pretty useful bits of advice, self-evidentiary good bits of advice, which are also provable scientifically. But they rely on often an appeal to authority, which Sagan says is one of the arguments you should be very suspicious of, because we're saying, oh, God told you not to kill each other. Well, it's not harmful in that regard. And if it's providing comfort and it's helping people, if it's not harmful, I don't have a problem with it. I have difficulty accepting with it, because for me, an argument that you can't prove is not particularly helpful. But if it's providing some comfort, then maybe it is providing a help. I think the danger comes when people rely on these types of unprovable hypotheses to justify actions that are patently damaging, and you can see that from the number of religious wars that have been fought down the centuries. So if you're basing scientific decisions to take some fairly serious action rather than just encouraging your children to go to bed early, then invoking God to do that is a pretty poor excuse, and we should be extremely skeptical of that and extremely wary.
And I think that leads on quite nicely, actually, to Andy's next comment, which is, isn't some fake news worse than others? For instance, the astronaut example that you had on the website was initially a mistake rather than intentionally malevolent, like, say, the grasshopper story.
Yeah, so it's interesting that Andy brings the point of motivation into it. So I think it's true that from the person telling the fake news, or providing the fake news, or providing the lie, there might be graduations of difference in how bad it is, whether they're doing it intentionally or unintentionally. But actually, from the receiver, from the person receiving that piece of untruth, it's not necessarily any different. So, like I say, there are some comforting lies that are harmless, and therefore we probably shouldn't worry too much about them. But there are also ones that are extremely harmful because they prompt us to take damaging actions, and those it doesn't actually matter whether the person reciting that untruth is doing it deliberately or accidentally, because they happen to believe it, because the consequence, the impact, is just as bad. And I actually think it's the impact that is more important than the intention. I think if you look at, you want to go back through history, you can talk about smoking. So for a long time, there was a big argument about whether smoking was beneficial or harmful to you. I'm sure many of the people who argued it was beneficial truly believed it was beneficial and didn't believe they were acting malevolently. But I think that's of little consolation to the millions of people who died of cancers as a result.
So I think this next question is quite interesting, actually. It's coming from Jack here. So if a piece of technology works, does it really matter if the person on the street knows how? For example, if a medical improvement is through placebo effect, wouldn't explaining this harm the patient?
Oh dear. So who was it who asked this question?
So this is Jack.
Jack, I think we have a politician in our group. How much is it safe to let the people know is a very political question that has been asked by politicians and leaders throughout centuries. My personal opinion, and this is an opinion, is that the better people are educated and the better people are informed, then the better able we are to make better decisions for ourselves, both individually and collectively. So I personally don't think secrets are a very good idea in general.
Yeah, that's fair enough. So then another question coming from Anna. How do you think we as a society should go about restoring trust in the news we consume?
Well, actually, I think that's quite a harsh comment. So, because I think there's much news that we consume that is eminently trustworthy, and if you look at most of the kind of serious-ish newspapers, and even the ones that aren't so serious, and websites and news establishments, they actually work very, very hard to make sure that their stories are grounded in truth. They may put a spin on them. Many of them put a spin on because they've got a particularly political affiliation. And something I encourage people to do is to often, if you're really not sure about a story, try and read about it from both sides of the political spectrum, because what you'll see there is you'll see the same facts, and those are the things you can trust, but you'll see them reported in different ways. There are websites and there are pieces of media that just print blatant untruths, and the techniques for detecting those are the same as they've always been, and the same as Sagan lists in his baloney detection kit. And the number one of those is obtain independent confirmation of the facts. So on the website, I use the example of a picture of a man holding a giant grasshopper, which is a picture that was faked in the 1900s. A good reason to believe that picture is fake is because there's not multiple versions of that picture. Because if there really was a grasshopper that was 4 feet long, even back in 1900 whatever it was, probably more than one person would have taken a picture of it, and you'd see it photographed from different angles. You'd probably see it photographed dissected. The fact that only that one picture exists is a real giveaway that that picture is probably fake. And I think that's the way to look at the news that you trust. So if you get a whiff of baloney off a news story printed in whatever source or broadcast through whatever source, then go and look for verification. If you see that story elsewhere, maybe even reported in a different way, it's probably true that the facts of that story are there. If you see a classic social media trick is you'll see a picture, but it'll be text. So you'll see a story, but it's actually like a JPEG. So it's not real text, and it'll be a quote from somebody or something like that, and it will be completely unattributable. So there won't be a reference. You won't be able to go and look up and see where that's quoted elsewhere. There'll be a lack of dates or names, so you won't be able to cross-reference it against Wikipedia or anything like that. So that's how you detect whether a story is false or not. So I'm not sure you should be trusting. To answer, was it Anna who asked the question?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not sure you should be trusting of the media, or you should be skeptical, and you should try and independently confirm things when you smell they're wrong. But I think it's equally wrong. And when I occasionally give talks to careers talks to teenagers, and when I cover this topic with that group of people, what I found is that many of them are extremely cynical, not just skeptical, but cynical. So they don't believe anything because they see so much conflicting information. They automatically discount everything, and I think that's just as bad. I think it's much better to be skeptical. That's what we want to be. We want to be skeptical, not cynical, because there is much great work happening out there in the field of journalism and news reporting. And we can trust that that's effective, but we should be skeptical and check the stories ourselves as well.
Certainly. And I think when I was having a look on your website at some of these stories that we shared for this World Space Week event, I did pick up that certainly the kit is a set of tools for us to decipher whether these stories that we're consuming are fake news or not, and that's a tool for ourselves to use. But do you think we have at all a responsibility to kind of let others know that this is fake news, or to do something to kind of stop people spreading the fake news, or sort of are there ways of doing that?
Definitely, if we perceive that a consequence of believing that fake news is harmful. So, like I say, there are some like folk stories or stories that are harmless, but there are other stories that are harmful. So when I first spoke to you about this, Chantal, one of the things I looked at was I went back and looked at the website and I thought, Coronavirus is obviously a hot topic at the moment. Maybe I should put a coronavirus story on the website to increase its topicality. And there's lots and lots and lots of fake news stories about coronavirus at the moment in the news. And I found one, which is one that probably many people have heard of, which is it's been a popular social media meme, shall we say, that 5G masts, telecommunication masts, are causing the coronavirus. And I found a YouTube video of a group of Chinese people ripping down a mast in China with the headline underneath, Chinese people rebel and rip down phone masts because it's causing the coronavirus. Now, if you did a little bit of investigation of this story, you found out that actually the clip was taken from Hong Kong, not from China at all. And it was actually protesters in Hong Kong from last year pulling down a mast with a closed circuit TV camera against it in their protests against the Chinese government. So the clip was taken completely out of context and put with a different headline underneath. Now, what happened is that some people went out and did that in the UK. They actually copied that action. That's pretty harmful action to be taking as a response to fake news. So I think we do have a duty. Absolutely, we have a duty to point out when we think news that could result in harmful actions is false, and to say, listen, it's false. Here's how you check that it's false. Here are the places you should go and look at. By the way, if you want to investigate fake news on coronavirus and see the fake news stories, there's a very good website called infotasian.com that's been started by a group of journalists, some media people, and then some people who were involved with the government, aren't government people anymore, and a couple of medical professionals, which basically lists a set of coronavirus stories and tells you how truthful they are or not, and gives you the references to go and cross-check them. So I highly recommend that website, infotasian.com.
Wonderful. And I guess, is that linked on your website as well?
Yeah, that's linked right at the bottom of the title page for Fakes News, and then I've also got an article about coronavirus on there.
Super. Okay, so we can check that out later. So another question then from Anna: could fake news be good for society if it does encourage us to take responsibility for fact-checking the news ourselves?
Well, I think we all depend on some shared rules and shared values. So there's psychologists talk about something called heuristics, and heuristics basically means behavior that we learn, but then we don't think about. So most of the time we don't sit there thinking about how to walk, and that we have to put one leg in front of the other, because we learn it at a very early age, and then it becomes second nature to us, and we don't think about it anymore. I think it's important that, and there are, and you can go into the cultural space and the governmental space, and say there are things that fall into that heuristic category, and without that, we wouldn't function, and society wouldn't function. But I think in terms of stuff that changes things, especially stuff that changes things significantly, we need to be skeptical, and we need to double check it. So I think whether we like fake news or not, or the seeming increase of its prevalence, there's not actually much we can do about that. That's happening anyway. There have always been, you go back thousands of years, there have always been snake oil salesmen. There have always been people who will tell you untruths in order to build their own profitability, and sometimes their motivations are oblique. So that has always been the case. That's never changed. What is different now is that the means of distribution, you can get your audience much easier, because it's a few clicks on a keyboard, and suddenly you've got the entire world's population able to consume whatever you want to peddle if they think it's interesting enough. So I've lost my captions. Hang on, let me just turn them on again. So I personally don't have a view of whether the increase in prevalence of fake news is a good thing or a bad thing. It annoys me that there are some people who are quite happy to peddle it quite so willingly, and that some of them achieve such prominence in society. But I think I think being skeptical is something that we really do need to increase.
Yeah. Another question here from Andy. Do you think the world is becoming increasingly polarized, which creates the environment for fake news?
I think it is possible, but I'm not sure increasingly polarized is right, because I think the world has always been fairly polarized, and in many ways the world is a fairer place, and people are seen as people more now than they were in the past. And you know, in hundreds of years ago, we had every country saw its own people as superior to every other country's people. And if you look at national anthems, you often see that kind of language enshrined in national anthems. So I'm not sure it's more polarized. I think what is happening is that it's becoming easier to live in those bubbles, because it's easier to cut yourself off from sources of information that you don't like, or people who don't agree with you. You know, the decrease in the circulation of conventional newspapers or conventional media means that more people are consuming stuff from what are now almost curated feeds, because they're getting it straight through their own internet sources. And I think there's a real danger in that you end up only listening to stuff that agrees with you. And I think that's a bad trend, I would say.
Mm. So quite an interesting question that's coming from Anna now. So what's the most shocking piece of fake news you've come across?
There are many shocking pieces of fake news, but one that really caught me by surprise was I did my interactive newsroom, which is how I normally do Carl Sagan's Guide to Fake News, back in a world where we can actually see people face to face and touch each other. I did it at a thing called the Big Bang Fair about 2 years ago, and a lady came up to me who was a Spanish origin, and I often get this because people think that because I run a site called Fake News, I know every fake news story in the world, which obviously isn't true. Which is one of the reasons I try and teach the method rather than rather than saying here's a list of stories that are true and here are not true. I haven't got the resources to do that, but there are plenty of people who do attempt to do that, and they're very well worth following. And she gave me a story that she had found on YouTube, which was that the Minions. Are you familiar with the Minions? They appear in several cartoon children's movies. Have you heard of those, Chantal?
Yeah, Despicable Me.
Despicable Me, absolutely. The Minions. She told me that she had a YouTube video that showed that the Minions were based on a series of experiments on children that were carried out by the Nazis in the Second World War. Right?
Wow.
That's quite a story, right? And she showed me a picture which showed people stood next to a German submarine or a German boat. It was clearly a German boat, dressed in outfits that looked a bit Minion-esque, if you can see what I mean, right? And actually, I went and checked the source of it. It wasn't that hard to check. And it's on Snopes, this particular story, if you want to go and look it up. The picture had come from a deep sea diving test. And one of the things that gave it away was that it was obviously from an earlier era than the Second World War. They were all kind of with the kind of handlebar moustaches that came more like the First World War era. So, but they genuinely did look a bit like Minions, all these people dressed in their deep sea diving helmets. But that was one that really caught me out of left field. I found that very shocking.
Yeah, certainly haven't heard of that one before. So when you are verifying these articles that come in, and you go to some of these verification sites that you list on your website, how can you be sure that those verification sites themselves are genuine and they're not sort of biased in any way?
Well, I think we all carry some inherent bias, so you have to use the same techniques with those as you would with anything else. It's just that it's generally a lot easier to do it with the verification sites because they're generally much more open about their sources. So basically, I recommend that people use Wikipedia when investigating fake news, but I recommend that they do it with a healthy dose of skepticism, because anybody can edit Wikipedia, and so it's often possible to find untruths or mistruths on Wikipedia. Generally, the giveaway for a mistruth on Wikipedia is if you see something in the text that doesn't sound right and there's no reference, and then you go to the bottom of the article where they list all the references and cross-references and sources, you won't find anything if it's just something that somebody's made up. So that's the first smell for it. So one of the reasons you can trust the verification sites is because they generally give you lots of links, lots of references, dates, names, people, stuff that you can go and cross-reference elsewhere to check that what they're saying is really true.
Okay, yeah. And I guess in putting together the stories that you already have on your website, what made you pick those stories, I guess, or is it just ones that you sort of like the look of the most or sort of prove the point the most? You know, what made you pick those? Because as you say, you can't obviously put them all up.
No, so I try to pick stories that appeal to a wide variety of interests, and also that appeal to my interest. I'm particularly interested in space stuff, so I've got a fair few space stories on my website, and it ties quite nicely with Carl Sagan. One of the first stories I picked on were the stories about Voyager and Jupiter, and I use those stories in particular because they have a direct relationship to Carl Sagan, because he worked on the Voyager program. But I try to pick stories which are not too politically divisive. So it's quite easy to find examples that of political parties telling mistruths. But I think if you, from my point of view, somebody is trying to educate the method rather than indoctrinate people into any particular political ideology, if I picked a story of a right-wing party telling a mistruth or a left-wing party being mistruth, it would come across as partisan. So I tend to avoid those types of stories. And I also want people to focus on the method rather than the shocking detail. So one of the reasons I don't put the Minion story up is because it is quite a shocking story, and I think people would be sandblasted by that rather than looking at the method. The things that I'm trying to get across is these are the things you should do: obtain independent confirmation of the facts. These are the things you shouldn't do: confuse correlation and causation, etc. So I hope that provides a guide. My favorite story on the website of the ones I've put up there is actually a relatively harmless one, although if you were the relatives of Theophilus Van Kannel, you'd probably feel slightly differently. So Theophilus Van Kannel was the man who invented the revolving door. And the reality of the situation is that he invented the revolving door because he was an inventor, and he saw a problem that needed fixing to do with the way airflow went through the receptions of large hotels. But somebody about 15, 16 years ago managed to construct a story that he did this because he was a misogynist and he hated women, and he disliked the idea of having to let women go through doors first. So invented the revolving door because that's very confusing if you're trying to let the lady go first through the door. And that story rather tickled my fancy because I thought it was quite a very tenuous link. What was interesting is the story got picked. It was just some blogger who originally printed that, but it got picked up and reprinted by a quite respectable Australian architecture magazine.
Yeah, it's very interesting, the connections, I guess, that some people make with stories, what their narrative is that they want to tell.
Yeah, I mean, generally, if you can start to smell the baloney, then it's worth applying the techniques.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, so there's still around about 20 minutes left of the session, so I'd encourage you to get any of your final questions into the question box, and in case people do start to drift away at this point, I just want to sort of remind everyone that this was another session as part of our World Space Week virtual takeover. And this has all been coordinated by the Institute of Physics South Central branch. And if you are interested in any of the other activities that we have taking place over this week, we have activities running all the way up to and including the 10th of October, all taking place virtually. All activities are free, and you can find the details of them on our Facebook page, IOP South Central branch, or Institute of Physics South Central branch, and on our Twitter page as well, IOP South Central. So do check them out.
So one of the things I'd like to say is that the world and the universe in general is a really amazing, incredible place. And we don't really need to make stuff up to show what an incredible place it is. I mean, this time last year, I remember it was World Space Week last year as well, and I was doing this activity in Guildford Library. And then when I got home, I turned on my phone, and I can't remember which social media feed I saw it in, but I found a picture that I thought might be a candidate for one of my fake news stories, because there was a picture of Luis Figo, the famous Portuguese footballer, the previous Ballon d'Or winner, walking up Guildford High Street, closely followed by an astronaut.
That's right.
Now, this, if you said that to somebody, I'm sure many people would cry fake news. That didn't happen, but actually it really did. That's absolutely 100% verifiable story, and you can apply the techniques because there's plenty of pictures of that from different angles to show you that it was true.
Yeah, and there was a few interesting comments that went along, I think, with that picture of whether or not it was indeed an astronaut or a beekeeper, and which would have been the most sensible during World Space Week. I think probably the astronaut, but as you say, it's often best to go with the simple solution.
Yes. Yeah, so that's Occam's Razor. Occam's Razor says that if you have a couple of competing hypotheses, the more simple one is likely to be accurate. In other words, if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, then it's probably a duck rather than a shape-changing alien. If it looks like Luis Figo and it's World Space Week, then it's probably an astronaut.
That's very true. Yeah. So another question coming from Anna here. So if someone wants to believe something is true, how do you convince them otherwise? Very good question.
Well, I think the answer is to that you can't. If somebody is determined to look, truth in the face and deny it, then there's very little you can do to convince them otherwise. And there's plenty of instances of history of where that's happened, and in general, it's fairly damaging where it does. But I would say that all you should do is you should confront with facts. And I think it's important, this point I made about skepticism and cynicism. There is such a thing as truth in this world and in this universe. There are truths. There are things. It's not that you can't believe anything. There's lots of stuff that you really can believe, and it's important to keep reinforcing that. And when you've got something that's true and verifiable, just lay out the evidence. And if people want to carry on denying it, well, I'm afraid there's not a lot you can do about that.
Yeah, indeed. People will believe, I guess, what they want to believe. I still
Yeah.
believe Santa's real, and no one can convince me otherwise.
Well, what's the simplest solution? What does Occam's Razor tell you, Chantal?
Well, yeah, there's also a nice not harmful lie in there, which
Exactly. But some comforting lies are harmless, and we probably shouldn't be too critical of those.
yeah. So another question from Anna. So does it help to validate the emotions behind someone's beliefs?
Could I get a bit more explanation on that question?
Okay,
I'm
yeah.
not sure I understand it properly.
Throw that back to you, Anna. So we'll wait for Anna to just type that back in. But and if anyone does have any additional questions, yeah, we're still around for another 15 minutes. And of course, this session is being recorded as well, and we'll be sharing it on our social media pages after the event. So hopefully, of all the tips and advice that you've got from John throughout this session, you can then share that social media video with your friends and family and get them thinking a bit more. Okay, so a bit more info come through from Anna. So if someone believes something because they are angry about some issue, does it help to start off by understanding that?
Yeah, so this is court of law types. This is the kind of, I think, is the best way to think about this stuff. So as well as doing this fake news work, I also give workshops to businesses and organizations on critical thinking. And critical thinking is really about decision making. And one of the things I talk about in that is something called procedural justice. And it's often when you see a horrible crime being broadcast on the TV news, you will often see the victims of that crime calling for more severe punishment, or that can even appear like a vengeance in that case. And there's a real risk that you can change law in error or wreak punishment that is unreserved. And indeed, it is the case. There are plenty of instances in history when public sentiment has resulted in innocent people receiving sentences that are unjust, and sometimes even the death penalty. So one of the things I would say about that is that you, from an individual point of view, you want to try and hold on to the facts and try and take some of the heat out of that, because it's seldom the case that decision that you would make in the heat of the moment of an instance like that, it might end up being a good decision, but it wouldn't necessarily be one that was made in the right way. It wouldn't be one that was based on reason or rationale argument, or on what thinking about the likely possible outcomes would come. One of the things I talk about when I do these workshops is I talk about something called 10-10-10, which is if you're in that situation where you feel you've got to make a decision and you're really worried about what to do, one way to give yourself some external perspective is to think about how you're going to feel, and I really mean this, how you're going to feel in 10 minutes, 10 months, 10 years about the decision you make. When I run that workshop, one of the things I do is early on, I ask people about regrets, either stuff they regret doing or stuff that they regret that they didn't do, without wishing to make it too confessional. And it's interesting, I tend to get more answers about regrets, that things that people didn't do. So if you ask people as they get towards the end of their lives, they'll go, oh, I wish I did more of that, or I wish I did more of the other, or I wish I'd done this. It's not, I wish I hadn't done this. There are occasions where you'll find people going, oh, wish I hadn't done this, but it's more common to have regrets about things that you didn't do. And that's, I think, is about feeling. It's about something called long-term emotion. Psychologists would call it long-term emotion, which is really about fulfilling our desires or needs. So short-term emotion, I think, can be quite harmful, and indeed it can cause the kind of issues I think that Anna's saying there, and that you can, you're angry, that can be a short-term emotion, and therefore you're denying the evidence that is in front of your face. People who talk about change cycles, who teach change cycles, will say that early, if you have a big upset in your life, which causes a lot of stress or anxiety, the first instinct that we have is denial. You know, we've refused to accept the changed situation, and for these phases last different lengths of time for different people, and you can see it today in that we've all gone through a fairly traumatic change in our lives with this coronavirus pandemic. And you know, it's a big deal, and it's very upsetting, and it's stopping us doing a lot of things that we like to do. And you can see there are still plenty of people who are living in denial about it, who won't accept the facts that we're living in a changed situation. I think what's very helpful to help you get through that phase and move on to, okay, what can I take out of this that's constructive? How can I make decisions in the future that will be constructive, not just to myself, but to the world in generally, is to take that longer term perspective. How am I going to feel about this 10 minutes, 10 years, 10 months, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is that helpful? I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, hopefully that was useful, Anna, as a response there. So we'll probably take one more question here, and this question's from Paul, and it starts off with an apology for it being a dumb question. I just want to say that actually, having read the question myself, I can confirm it is not a dumb question, and it's actually a very interesting question. So it's no such thing as a stupid question, Paul. So why does anyone want to propagate fake news? I know the power of the media is immense and they want to control their narrative, but are we gullible enough, or do we just want to believe that we are being controlled by 300 powerful people and that we have no control, e.g. removing ownership from our own actions?
Yeah, okay. Yes, it's definitely not a dumb question. There are dumb answers to that question. I hope I don't give any of them. Definitely not a dumb question. So my view here, and again, this is a view because I'm not sure I'm the full authority to talk about this, is that there is something comforting about surrounding ourselves by things that we know and love and are familiar with. Often we get more long-term reward by stepping outside of that box or that bubble, but it's quite easy, and I think some of that is instinctual and goes back, you know, to our animalistic forebears. Most you know, apes live in kind of small family groups. There's a researcher called Todorov who's done a lot of work on faces, people's faces, and he was trying to look for, you know, there was a Victorian thing called phrenology, which is saying you could determine somebody's personality by the bumps on the heads. All complete snake oil, all complete hokum, but you know, a lot of people made some money out of propagating this fake news. And he was trying to see if there was any truth in this with regard to faces. And what he did was he put lots and lots of pictures of people's faces in front of other people and asked them, you know, which ones do you prefer, which ones do you prefer? And the only thing he found out from that research, there wasn't any kind of obvious correlation between size of ear or forehead or nose or anything like that. The only thing he found out from that research is that we tend to prefer faces that are like people we already like. So in other words, we trust people who look like people we already trust. Now, if you think about that in the context that might have been kind of a worthwhile heuristic or way of working, you know, 10, 20,000 years ago, when basically everybody you lived with was part of your extended family and therefore did look a bit like you. But these days, it's not true when we live in a wider world. And if you look at the consequences for things like recruitment decisions, it's actually quite damaging. You know, advice I would give to any employer or employer is make sure you keep pictures off the CVs of employers, potential employees, when you're filtering them, because the way somebody's look is no guide to how they're going to behave in a professional environment, and you will have that kind of bias almost hardwired in. It's almost impossible to avoid. So I think, you know, there is something instinctual in people that means that we are receptive to some types of fake news, and it's something we have to be wary of. I think there are some unscrupulous people who will play on that and will use that weakness in ourselves for whatever ends they have, be it political power or monetary wealth, or just to increase their influence. I mean, there are many conspiracy theorists on the internet, some of whom I think, you know, actually believe this stuff, but some of whom do it just because if they get more clicks, they'll get more followers to their website, and that will generate a little bit of income for them because they'll get some advertising or something associated with that. So the motivations for peddling fake news are kind of many and varied. I think we just have to be on the lookout for it and be prepared, because it's not going to go away. You know, as long as the means of distribution exist to get it out there, people will always continue to do it. The only thing that stops fake news is if people stop believing it and execute the type of techniques that I'm proposing.
Yeah, wonderful. And I think that's a really nice way to sort of close off the session then. And hopefully everyone feels a little bit more prepared now for handling those fake news articles and how we can verify and have more confidence in what we're reading, and put those skills to good use. And a nice final comment from Anna that your responses have been very helpful, and thank you very much for your time today.
Well, thank you, Chantel. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, everybody who's attended. I've really enjoyed this session. Please spread the word, because I think it's important that we get it out there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, John.
Cheers, Chantel. Lovely.